text I got from my dad read, "Can't deal with this right now. We're in the middle of something." I was lying in a hospital bed in Vancouver General with a fractured pelvis, a broken collarbone, and a drainage tube coming out of my side. I'd been hit by a pickup truck that ran a red light on Cambie Street at 11:40 on a Wednesday night. I remember the sound more than anything, not the impact, but the sound of my own voice saying, "Oh," before everything went sideways. The nurse who found my phone in my jacket pocket had dialed my parents' number first. My dad picked up. She told him his daughter had been in a serious accident and was going into emergency surgery. He said he'd call back. He texted instead. I didn't see the text until I woke up. I'd been under for almost 9 hours. My shoulder was pinned, my pelvis was plated, and the first thing I did when the nurse handed me my phone was check if anyone had called. There were 4 messages from my friend Justine, 2 from a coworker, and 1 text from my dad. "Can't deal with this right now. We're in the middle of something." Sent at 12:17 a.m. I put the phone face down on the blanket and stared at the ceiling for a long time. My name is Tara. I'm 31 years old. I work in project coordination at a mid-size architecture firm in Vancouver, and until about 14 months ago, I genuinely believed, that my family was just a little cold. Busy people. High-achieving, not the hugging type. I don't know why non Thibosban, that not every family expressed love the same way, that my parents had built something from nothing and I should be grateful for what they'd given me. I had a whole mental filing system for reframing every single thing they did. My mom forgot my university graduation. I filed it under. She had a work conference in Toronto. It couldn't be helped. My dad missed my first real apartment, the one I saved for 2 years to afford. He never came to see it. I filed that under. He's not sentimental about real estate. It's not personal. When I called home after getting promoted and my mom said, "That's nice, but when are you going to move into something with more stability? Project coordination isn't really a career." I filed that under, she worries. It comes from love. I had so many files. I'd been filing things away since I was about 9 years old, and by the time I was lying in that hospital bed, the cabinet was full. My grandfather drove down from Abbotsford the morning after my surgery. He's 74, and he still drives himself, still tends his quarter-acre garden, still makes his own bread on Sundays. He walked into my room with a thermos of tea and a paper bag of the oatmeal cookies he always kept in a tin above his fridge, and he sat down in the plastic chair beside my bed and just looked at me for a moment. "You scared the hell out of me," he said. "I scared myself," I said. He reached over and held my hand, carefully, around all the IV lines. He didn't say anything else for a while. He didn't need to. My grandfather has always been the one who showed up. When I was 12 and I had my tonsils out and my parents were at a conference in Calgary, he drove 2 hours to sit with me in the recovery room. When I graduated high school, he was the one who took me out for dinner after, just the 2 of us at a diner in Langley, and told me he was proud of me like he meant it in his whole chest, not just his mouth. He told me that day that I was the most capable person he knew from my age, and that he hoped I never let anyone make me feel small, including people who were supposed to love me. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was 31 and lying in a hospital bed. My parents arrived on the 3rd day. I want to be precise about this. It was 71 hours after the surgery. 71 hours after I was struck by a truck, had emergency surgery, and woke up in the ICU. I had been transferred to a regular ward by then. My grandfather had gone home the night before, reassured that I was stable, promising to come back on the weekend. My mom came in first. She was wearing a blazer, which told me they'd come straight from somewhere, probably their office, which was in Burnaby. She looked around the room like she was assessing it, then looked at me. "You look better than I expected," she said. "Hi, Mom," I said. My dad came in behind her. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at the monitors, at the drainage tube, at my shoulder brace. Then he sat down in the chair by the window and took out his phone. "The traffic was brutal," my mom said, pulling up the other chair. "We should have taken the Patullo." I didn't say anything. She asked me what the doctors had said. I explained the pelvis, the collarbone, the recovery timeline, 12 weeks minimum before I could put weight on my left side, 6 months before I'd be anywhere close to normal. She nodded while I talked, but her eyes kept going to her own phone on the edge of the bed. My dad asked if my firm had disability coverage. I said yes through Sun Life. He nodded and said good and looked back at his phone. They stayed for 40 minutes. On their way out, my mom said she'd try to come back the following week if her schedule opened up. My dad patted my right hand, the one without the IV, and said, "Hang in there, kiddo," in a tone you'd use on a vague acquaintance. The door closed behind them and I listened to the hum of the ward and I thought, I have been waiting my whole life for these people to show up, and they showed up for 40 minutes and spent most of it on their phones. I stopped filing things that afternoon. Before the surgery, before I'd even fully regained consciousness, there had been a window of a few hours where I was under and unreachable, and my parents were listed as my emergency contacts. The hospital had reached them. They had been given the opportunity to be present, and instead, my father had texted at 12:17 a.m., and no one from my family had entered that building until I was already 3 days into recovery. What I didn't know yet was what they'd done with that window. 3 weeks after I was discharged, I was staying at my grandfather's place in Abbotsford. His house has a main floor bedroom with a walk-in shower he'd installed when my grandmother's knees got bad, and he'd set up a proper hospital-style rail beside the bed. He drove me to my physio appointments. He cooked, real food, not delivery, the same way he'd always cooked, roasted chicken and root vegetables and soup from scratch. One evening, I was going through my banking notifications, something I hadn't done properly since before the accident, and I noticed a transaction I didn't recognize. Then another one. Then I opened my online account properly and sat there in my grandfather's guest room, reading through 3 weeks of history I had not made. There were 2 withdrawals from my TFSA. One was $4,200, one was $3,800, both made while I was in hospital. There was a change of address request on my main checking account to my parents' address in Burnaby. And there was an application, a credit application, made in my name for a secured line of credit against my condo, the condo I'd bought 2 years ago. The application had been submitted while I was still in the ICU. I sat very still for a long time. Then I called my grandfather into the room and showed him my screen. He put on his reading glasses and read through everything. Then he took his glasses off and set them down on the nightstand and said, very quietly, "Tara, do you know how this is possible?" I did know, or I was beginning to. When I'd first bought the condo, my parents had offered to help me navigate the paperwork. I was 29 and it was my first property, and they said they'd done this before. They understood the process. My mom was the one who sat with me at the notary. There had been a lot of documents. One of them, and I remembered signing something I'd only half read because my mom was rushing me, saying, "It's standard. It's just standard banking authorization. Everyone does this," was a financial power of attorney. I had signed a financial POA naming both of my parents as my authorized agents. I remembered thinking it was a bit odd, but telling myself, "She's my mother. She wouldn't. She means well. File it away." I need to explain what a financial POA means in British Columbia because it matters. A financial power of attorney authorizes someone to manage your financial affairs on your behalf. In most cases, it's used for elderly parents or people who are genuinely incapacitated. It is not supposed to be used by adult children's parents to access their accounts while the adult child is unconscious in a hospital. It is also, and this is the part that took me a few days to fully process, revocable at any time by me. My grandfather drove me to a lawyer in Abbotsford the next morning. I was in a wheelchair and had my left arm in a brace, and I'd barely slept, and I didn't care about any of that. The lawyer, a woman in her 60s who did estate and family law and who did not seem remotely surprised by anything I told her, explained my options clearly and without any unnecessary softness. She said, you can revoke the PA effective immediately. You can report the unauthorized transactions to your bank and request an investigation. You can pursue civil recovery of the withdrawn funds, and depending on what the investigation finds, you can make a referral to the RCMP. I said, let's start with the revocation. The revoking of a financial power of attorney in BC requires a signed document, a witness, and a notarized copy sent to all named agents. My lawyer prepared it that same afternoon. I signed it. My grandfather was my witness. I also called my bank. A fraud specialist walked me through a formal dispute process. The address change was reversed. The credit application, which had not yet been approved, apparently still in processing, was flagged and cancelled. The 2 withdrawals were frozen pending investigation. My parents didn't know any of this had happened yet. They found out 17 days later when a registered letter arrived at their Burnaby address from my lawyer. The letter contained the revocation notice, a formal demand for repayment of the $8,000 in withdrawn funds, and a notice that the actions were under review by both the bank's fraud department and, now, an RCMP financial crimes referral. I know about the letter's arrival because my mom called me 20 minutes after it would have been delivered. I watched the phone ring. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times that day. My dad called twice. Then my mom called for 8, and the meter I didn't recognize, someone's cell, maybe an office line, and I picked up without thinking. Tara, her voice was tight, controlled. The voice she used in meetings, this is completely unnecessary. We were trying to protect your assets while you were incapacitated. We had authorization. You had a document I signed without understanding what it was, I said, while you were rushing me. We did nothing wrong. That's going to be for the investigation to decide, I said. There was a pause. Then, do you have any idea how this makes us look? And I thought, there it is. There's the real question. Not are you okay? Not we're sorry we weren't there. Not even can we explain. Just, how does this make us look? I have to go, I said. Don't call me on unknown numbers again. I hung up. I want to be honest about how I felt in the weeks after, because I think people expect this kind of story to end with clarity and relief, and the truth is messier than that. There were nights at my grandfather's house when I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Ugly, exhausted crying that had nothing to do with my pelvis or my shoulder, and everything to do with grief. Not rage. Grief. Because somewhere underneath all those carefully filed away memories, I had still believed on some level that when it really counted, they would come. That the accident would be the thing that broke through whatever wall existed between us and made them show up properly, the way parents were supposed to show up. Instead, my dad texted at 12:17 a.m. and they took $8,000 from my savings while I was under anesthetic. My grandfather let me cry without trying to fix it. He'd bring tea and sit nearby and not say anything wise or reframing, which was the right instinct. One night he said, I tried to talk to your father about this, about the way they treated you, a long time ago. He told me to mind my own business. What did you say? I asked. I told him you were my business, he said, and that never changed. The investigation took about 2 months. The bank's fraud team determined that the POA had been used outside of its intended scope. I had not, in fact, been legally incapacitated in the way the document required. And the transactions had taken place during hours when hospital records showed I was recovering but conscious and communicating. My parents' lawyer tried to argue the interpretation of incapacitated. It didn't hold up particularly well. The civil demand was settled before it went to court. My parents repaid the $8,000. My lawyer's fees came out of that. There was no criminal prosecution. The Crown declined to proceed given the civil resolution and the family relationship, but the RCMP file exists, and both of my parents' names are attached to it. I don't know exactly how they felt about that. I've spoken to neither of them since the phone call. While all of this was being sorted out, I was also rebuilding something else. The condo, my finances, the way I thought about the future. I changed my emergency contacts to my grandfather and Justine. I updated every financial document, every beneficiary designation, every account authorization. I had a proper independent lawyer review every piece of paperwork that had my name on it, and I paid for that review myself, and it was worth every dollar. I also updated my will. My grandfather is the executor. He cried a little when I told him. He said that was too much responsibility for a 74-year-old. I told him he was the only person I trusted with it. He said he'd do it then. I went back to work in January, part-time at first, remote, then back in the office by March. My colleagues had sent a card when I was in hospital, signed by everyone on the team, with a gift card for DoorDash and a note that said, "We've got you covered. Take your time." My manager had navigated the Sun Life paperwork for me while I was recovering. These were people I'd worked with for 3 years, and I don't think I'd ever properly seen them before. In April, about 6 months after the accident, I was at physio in Vancouver when I ran into a woman I'd gone to university with, someone I hadn't seen in maybe 8 years. We grabbed coffee after my session. I told her what had happened, the broad version, the version where I didn't cry in a coffee shop. She listened the whole way through without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "I've been in therapy for 2 years working through almost the exact same dynamic with my parents, minus the fraud." "Does it get easier?" I asked. "It gets cleaner," she said. "Like, the grief doesn't get smaller, but the confusion does. Eventually, you stop wondering why they are the way they are, and you just accept that this is who they are. And once you accept that, you stop waiting for them to be different. And that's when you get your life back." I've thought about that conversation a lot since then. My grandfather turned 75 in June. I drove out to Abbotsford with a carrot cake I'd baked myself, badly, lopsided, with slightly too much cream cheese frosting, and we had dinner at his kitchen table with 3 of his neighbors who've been his friends for 30 years. They're loud and funny, and they kept teasing him about his garden being overrun with zucchini, and he laughed the way he laughs, with his whole face. At the end of the night, after the neighbors had gone home, we sat on his back porch and he poured us both a small glass of rye and we watched the light go down over the Fraser Valley. "You doing okay?" he asked. Same thing he'd asked me in the hospital, same way. "Yeah," I said. And for the first time since all of this happened, I actually meant it. "I think I really am." He nodded. He didn't say anything. He just put his arm around my shoulders carefully because he still remembered which one had been broken, and we sat there until it got dark. I am not going to tell you that cutting contact with my parents has been easy, because it hasn't. There are moments, holidays mostly, and occasionally just a random Tuesday, when I feel the absence of it in a way that's hard to describe. Not the absence of who they are, the absence of who I always wanted them to be. But I think about what my grandfather said about being someone's business and that never changing. I think about how he drove 2 hours to Abbotsford in the rain to sit with me when I was 12, and how he drove down to Vancouver the morning after my surgery, and how he sat in that plastic chair with tea and cookies and held my hand around all the IB lines. I spent a long time trying to earn that kind of love from people who were never going to give it to me. And there it was, the whole time, in a house in Abbotsford with a lopsided garden and a tin of oatmeal cookies above the fridge. Some people spend their whole lives looking for a safe place to land. I was lucky enough to have one. I just had to stop being so busy looking somewhere else to see it. There's a moment I keep coming back to. My dad's text sitting on my phone screen while I was still wired to monitors, still trying to figure out how badly my body was broken. "Can't deal with this right now." 7 words. That was the full weight of what I meant to them in that moment. For a long time, I would have found a way to file that away. I was good at that. I'd had years of practice turning their failures into something I could live with, smoothing down the edges so I could keep reaching toward people who weren't really reaching back. I think a lot of us do that. We call it loyalty, we call it family, we call it not giving up. But somewhere underneath it, if we're honest, it's just fear. Fear that if we stop excusing it, we'll have to admit how alone we actually are. What I learned, lying in that hospital bed, is that the moment you stop excusing it is not the moment you become alone. It's the moment you realize you never were. My grandfather drove 2 hours in the rain because that's what he does. He has always done that. He was doing it when I was 12 and couldn't see it properly, and he was still doing it at 74, thermos of tea in hand, sitting in a plastic chair without being asked. The love was there the whole time. I just kept looking past it at the people who weren't showing up. I think about what it took to get to that lawyer's office in Abbotsford. In a wheelchair, collarbone braced, running on almost no sleep, and I think that's the version of myself I want to hold on to. Not because I was brave in any dramatic sense, but because I finally did the thing that mattered instead of the thing that was comfortable. I stopped protecting people who weren't protecting me. I looked at what the bank statements actually said, and I let myself understand it, even though understanding it meant I couldn't unknow it. That kind of clarity is hard to come by. It costs something, but it's the only thing that actually moves you forward. There's a version of this story where I call my mom back, where I let her explain, where I tell myself it was complicated, that they meant well, that family is family. I know that version by heart because I lived it for 29 years. And I want to be clear, I don't tell this story to say that version is wrong for everyone. Some things are repairable. Some families find their way back to each other. But some don't. And learning to tell the difference, learning to see people for what they actually do rather than what you need them to be, that's not bitterness. That's judgment. The real kind. The kind that takes time and honesty and a willingness to feel the grief of it without letting the grief talk you out of the truth. Grandpa turned 75 in June. I brought a lopsided carrot cake and we sat on his porch and watched the light go down over the valley. He put his arm around my shoulders, careful of the one that had been broken, and I thought, this is what it feels like. Not the version I used to imagine. The one with parents who rushed to the hospital and held my hand through the hot pots. This, right here. Real and steady and completely unglamorous and enough. I spent a long time looking somewhere else. I'm glad I finally stopped.